Welcome to the Culture Bar, a panel discussion podcast exploring, dissecting, and shedding light on important topics in the arts and music world which matter to you.
Hello, I'm Henry Southern, and today on the Culture Bar, as we continue our Under the Spotlight series, we'll be discussing contested heritage. To explore this, I'm delighted to be joined by Corinne Fowler, Professor of Postcolonial Literature at the University of Leicester, who is also Director of the Colonial Countryside National Trust Houses Reinterpreted project, and Ed Vaizey, Member of the House of Lords, who served as Culture Minister from 2010 to 2016. And of course, he's the co-host of his own podcast, Breakout Culture. It's great to have you both with us. Welcome.
Thanks, Henry.
Hello.
Nice to be here.
Great to have you with us. Thank you. Well, this is a very pertinent topic. In February, Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden met with 25 leaders of English heritage organisations, including the likes of the National Trust, Historic England, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Arts Council England, the British Museum and the Imperial War Museum, all to discuss contested heritage. So I'm going to come first to our resident professor, Corinne. Can you just tell us what is contested heritage?
I think it's an interesting term in itself, actually, because it makes you wonder what is it we're contesting? Are we contesting our involvement with slavery? Do we mean difficult or sensitive histories? But ultimately, it's history that tends to relate to the 400 years in which we were an active British Empire.
Thank you. And this is obviously can be a very emotive and potentially divisive issue. Ed, I'm going to ask you, do you think we have an effective platform for debate around this very important topic?
Well, it's become a very heated debate, and it's generating more heat than light at the moment, which I think is very unfortunate. I think, based on Corinne's definition, contested heritage is a perfectly legitimate area for scholarly examination and debate. We have a kind of island story, if you like, and it's about Britain ruling the waves and the British Empire. And there's a debate about the kind of pluses and minuses of Britain's contribution to the world based on that empire, if you like. And there's a particular narrative that's been prevalent for many years, which is the British Empire was a good thing and brought many good things to many of the countries that were part of the empire. But there's more and more awareness that there were some bad things as well, some very bad things. And I think there's nothing wrong with exploring that and debating it in a mature way. And nobody is saying, that we have to be, as it were, ashamed of our history, that we have to fall on one side or the other. The point about history is it's nuanced. And also, I think that history is a living thing. I'm straying very much into Corinne's territory here, but history is a living thing, and every generation is entitled, as it were, to interpret historical events through the prism of their own current values and morals. But that's not to say that you can't understand that people who behaved in a certain way in the 18th century behaved in what was, in inverted commas, regarded as normal, but it doesn't mean that you have to gloss over it or that you have to say, oh, that was unquestionably a good thing. And if you don't think it's a good thing, then there's something wrong with you. I think it's a nuanced debate, and I find it a great pity that it's become this sort of heated debate where you're forced to take a side, and if you pick the wrong side, you're somehow in trouble.
I think it's music to my ears to hear somebody talking about the importance of having a calm and mature debate, because really this history is quite often seen using what historians call a balance sheet approach. Was empire a good thing or a bad thing? And we tend to sort of judge it through the lenses of the present if we're not careful. But it's really important not to think about empire in terms of predominantly guilt or shame, because that obscures, as Ed was suggesting, the whole range of and the sort of nuance of empire. I mean, empire was a monumental historical development. It had so many different angles and legacies, both for people of formerly colonized countries and the mass movement of people for a start. But also it was very formative of Britain. So it's really helpful to think, well, when we're talking about empire, we're not just talking about the slave trade, we're talking about the East India Company, we're talking about all kinds of subtle effects of empire and the history of ideas. We're talking about literary engagement with empire. I mean, let's think about all the literature that was written during the days of empire. You've got novels like The Moonstone, one of our classics, which is all about a stolen diamond by an East India Company servant that ends up in a country house in Yorkshire. So there's so much, it's integral to our culture, and it's so central to some of our heritage sites, not all of them by any means.
I think
but it's still well worth considering the full range of stories from Chinese wallpaper to plantation wealth and to enslavement and so on, in subtle and sort of nuanced ways.
And I think, I mean, I was going to jump in there again, slightly entering Corinne's territory. She's much more of an expert than I am, but my understanding is that, you know, as it were, when we talk, if we're using this label contested heritage, I mean, contested heritage was contested at the time. There was debates in England, as it were, in the 18th century about empire and about both the triumphs of empire and the crimes of empire, and in the Victorian age as well.
I think that's a really important point that Ed makes there, that it's important to realise that within Britain, there was no unified view of empire. There were strong anti-colonial thinkers. There were abolitionist thinkers, black abolitionists and white abolitionists working together. So it's really important to understand that Britain didn't think as one ever. It doesn't now, and it didn't then.
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention was that there is a perception that certain museums and heritage sites are championing one view of history, and the fact, well, put it very simply, that British history is bad and to be apologised for, and that's one side of the debate. But it's really encouraging to hear you, as you quite rightly say, the debate is far more nuanced than that, and there are multiple narratives. But do you think it's fair to say that the likes of the National Trust, etc., are just championing one view of history at the moment?
I think it's a really interesting objection to raise, because for decades, the National Trust houses, which have quite strong connections to the British Empire, some of which were genuinely not known about or forgotten, they didn't talk about those connections at all. So it was one-sided in the sense that for those sites, for example, Basildon Park is a great example. Basildon Park was built with the profits of East India Company High Office, and that estate, the house, was built with that money. So if we don't talk about that, it seems rather evasive and one-sided to concentrate on its later history at the expense of its absolutely foundational story. And so I think that the idea that something's one-sided rather than a corrective to decades of silence is probably a much more accurate way to think about the history of representation of British heritage sites. And I think that it's also important to recognise that, you know, that things like the National Trust report are associated with what you might call perceived threat, that it's unfamiliar and sometimes shocking to learn these things. Although there was a survey from Policy Exchange that suggested that 76% of National Trust members really are quite open-minded about the idea of incorporating colonial history into the general history of those sites. But I think that it can come as a shock, partly because our general knowledge about those 400 years of colonialism is not actually that good. And I don't think any government has really addressed that in terms of our education. This is why it also is so unfamiliar to us.
Well, I just want to pick up on that because there was a survey in The Guardian recently that 1 in 10 GCSE students are studying a module dedicated to empire. Less than 8% learn about Britain's colonialisation of Africa, but 80% are taught about the Tudors. Ed, you're in government. Why is this?
Yeah, well, I studied history at Oxford, so I don't know any history. The ability to kind of specialise and narrow down in almost any subject that we study in the English education system is pretty shocking, and that's a whole other debate about how we educate our children. But I think that's the point. I mean, I know that Corinne's written her book Green Unpleasant Land, and I hesitate to plug another book therefore on this podcast, but I've read Satnam Sangra's Empire Land, and I follow his tweets, and it's interesting that apart from obviously the abuse he gets for daring to present a nuanced picture of empire, a lot of people are saying, look, I had no idea about empire until I read your book. And I think it is, I mean, the point about that book is that I think, echoing what Corinne was saying earlier, that empire is absolutely part of our living culture today in terms of the language we use, and as I said earlier, the sort of story we tell about our country. And yet it's barely studied at school. And there are lots of aspects of empire that do need to be studied and debated. And it should be about what the great kind of leitmotif of English education is, which is kind of critical thinking and the ability to examine facts and come up with different interpretations and weigh them against each other. So I think that if this kind of fevered culture war that we're going through ends up with people saying, actually, we just need to study this perhaps in more detail and perhaps at school, that would be a very good thing. But I think going back to what Corinne was saying, you know, one of the reasons I very much support the work she did and what the National Trust did, I mean, it landed at a time when the Black Lives Matter debate was very prominent, and it got caught up in that kind of politics, if you like. But for me, it's about you know, Corinne said it was a sort of corrective for the National Trust. It's about embracing people who have different heritage to, say, someone like me, who's a classic middle class, public school educated white male, and telling them stories that are relevant to their heritage and will resonate with them. And one of the things that drives me mad is when people really get on their high horse about organizations which are by and large relatively traditional, trying to reach out to new audiences. I mean, I remember the bizarre row when the Lake District Tourist Authority asked itself the question, why are most of our visitors white, late, middle-aged tourists? Is there something we could do that might attract people from a different demographic? And this was regarded as somehow blasphemous. I don't see that at all.
It's such an interesting point that one of the fascinating things about the National Trust report was that it flags up for us new research about the African, Indian and Chinese presence in the countryside. And this is really, really important information. And a lot of this historical work has just been done quite recently over the last 20 years. So it's also emerged because of new databases that people have access to, archives which have been looked at in different ways or opened up, such as the legacies of British slave ownership. And so we have so much more information than we ever had before, that it's a wonderful opportunity to start looking afresh at our history. And although the term rewriting history is often used as an insult, that is what historians do. It's what archaeologists do with Stonehenge, for example. You know, you get some new evidence, and in the light of that evidence, you then reappraise the history of Stonehenge. You know, it was first put somewhere else, and then it was moved 120 kilometers to where it is today. Why isn't that interesting? Why isn't the history of Chinese wallpaper or colonial administration interesting, for example? So I think, it's the culture war is unfortunate in many senses because it stops us having these interesting conversations about our past. Although they have to be had sensitively, it's only adds to and enriches our knowledge. I mean, I did see that the leader of the 56 Common Sense MPs, Sir John Hayes, suggested that an Historic England report should be shredded the other day. And this is by a really eminent historian of empire, Madge Dresser and Mary Wills. And it's a really helpful new sort of bringing together of all our existing historical knowledge about various heritage sites and buildings, our built heritage. But, you know, shredding and book burning and stuff doesn't work very well in a digital age. And it is really important, as Satnam Sanghera says, to have that conversation without people writing to him and saying if he doesn't like British history, he should go back to India, which is just so hurtful. Yeah, I mean, it's important to have these conversations, and thinking also about some of the things which we have here. I was thinking about going back to what Ed was saying about new audiences and so on. But at the National Trust at Clarendon Park, for example, it has a beautifully carved Maori house called Hinamihi, and it was brought here by the governor of New Zealand, and it was paid for with, I don't know, it was £50 or something. It was brought around 1892, I think, and some of the ancestors of the sort of descendants of the carver, the original carver, actually came to that site, and they said that they could feel the presence of their Maori ancestors. And London's Maori communities now come to that house, and they've adopted it as a meeting house to think about culture and their own heritage. So I think places like that are really, really important and fascinating aspects of our history.
Absolutely. And you there, Corinne, to the Common Sense Group, something I want to discuss as well. So it's made up of 59 MPs, 7 members of the House of Lords, colleagues of Ed's, and they're highly critical of what they call, quote, the woke agenda. In fact, in a letter to the Telegraph at the end of last year, they said history must neither be sanitized nor rewritten, so picking what you said there earlier, Corinne, to suit snowflake preoccupations. A clique of powerful, privileged liberals must not be allowed to rewrite our history in their image, which is obviously quite powerful stuff. They accuse the National Trust of being a group of elite bourgeois liberals, and Jonathan Gullis MP even referred to the Greenwich Maritime Museum's research into the Royal Navy's link to slavery as left-wing ideological nonsense. I mean, this is all quite strong stuff, and again, draws on that sort of quite divisive debates. But what it comes down to, I gather, is the heritage sector, or they believe the heritage sector is giving too much emphasis to colonialism, slavery. Are these fair points, or are these quite outrageous?
Well, I find it completely bizarre. I mean, I know John Hayes, and John Hayes does not shy away from a dust up and an argument, but I think that his approach and tone is very, very bizarre, but it's a very easy way to get headlines. And again, it's a very lazy way to have a debate, but it's very easy to write a newspaper article that somehow there's this terrible liberal woke agenda. And I just think it's complete and utter nonsense. And what I find odd is that, you know, the kind of traditional institutions that some conservatives seek to take on strike me as very odd enemies to have. I mean, I don't want to put words into the mouth of the National Trust, but I suspect you'd be hard pushed to find a more small c conservative institution. And it's a lot more popular than the Conservative Party. It's got 5 million members. And you'd be hard pushed to find a more staid and conservative small c institution than the Royal Museum's Greenwich in their classic neoclassical buildings, celebrating Britain's naval and maritime heritage. And I think that to explore in an academic, thoughtful way our links with colonialism and our colonial past does not in any way undermine, if that's what your argument is, the British way of life. And I can't help thinking about sort of Don Quixote tilting at windmills. I mean, the idea that the kind of institutions of the British state are going to collapse because we happen to make the points, some of the points that Corinne's been making, for example, about some of the links between houses and the fortunes they were built on, is just ludicrous. But what it will do, I think, which I very much positively support, is to reach out to new communities in our country who feel excluded from our history. They either feel excluded because the stories, the bad stories, aren't being told and their perspective is not being balanced, or because, as Corinne hinted earlier, many of these communities have been part of our history for many, many years. They didn't just arrive in the 1950s. They've been part of our history for hundreds of years. And that, to the people I know, is a wonderful thing for them to feel that they are now part of the narrative. So I completely agree. I thought Corinne put it brilliantly well about the rewriting of history. Every generation rewrites history based on new facts. I happened to study the 18th century history, and 18th century political history is rewritten by every generation of historians because they want to put their mark on it. So I don't know whether the Common Sense Group, I haven't heard from them for a while. Maybe they've run out of steam. Maybe they've realized that their arguments have hit a brick wall, but they're bizarre fights to pick, I have to say, but they get easy headlines.
Corinne, I know that
yeah,
you personally have also been on the receiving end of this for your work with the National Trust.
Oh, very much so. And at one point, I feared that there was a deliberate attempt to discredit me and my team of historians. It felt a bit like a juggernaut coming towards me on the pavement with all these very influential columnists writing that we were politically biased academics, and even attributing things to us that we most certainly hadn't said. So the Daily Mail at one point reported that I said gardening was racist because I've got a chapter in my book about botany and empire and the relationship between plants and the movement of people and commercial trading networks. So, and I can't tell you how much hate mail and how horrible that hate mail was and the threats that I got because of that. So I think people are playing with fire if they want to stir up people's anxieties at a time when we have a pandemic and there's so much grief and uncertainty in all of our lives that it's just not really a very responsible thing to do. But I think ultimately, to get back to the idea of woke, I mean, first of all, it's got quite a painful history, that word, because really it's connected to the civil rights movement and the idea of being awake to injustice. But it's become a term of abuse in a kind of rather strange twist of fate. And I think that it's the kind of thing that stops us from listening to one another. I mean, as Ed's demonstrated so well just now, within the Conservative Party, there is a wide range of views about history and approaches to history, culture. It's a very broad church. So that I don't think the 59 MPs can be considered to be representative of the Conservative Party, I'm sure. But I do think that using terms like woke, so woke professor are the two words that go in front of my name, in the 138 or so articles deriding my work, that really stop ideas getting a fair hearing, and they stop us from having engaging conversations with each other about the past.
Yes, hear, hear. I just want to change tact a little bit and talk specifically actually about UK government policy. The main focus of their agenda at the moment is this retain and explain policy. Ed, could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Well, I think if retain and explain means what I think it means, then I'm sort of potentially quite supportive. I'm not a person who wants to see people tearing down statues, particularly. I mean, I can see why people might want statues moved or indeed put in a museum as opposed to being put on a plinth, but I don't support sort of direct action to tear it down and chuck it in the river necessarily. And I can understand why you might want to debate a particular artifact or statue staying in place, but having, in effect, agreeing, I suspect, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but agreeing with Corinne's point, which is interpreting it in a new way, bringing into play facts that have hitherto not been put in front of the public. And that is, I understand, effectively what the National Trust research is doing. You're not going to tear down a house because it was built with the proceeds of empire, but you are going to explain how the person who built that house could afford to do so. So in that sense, retain and explain is a perfectly benign policy, and there will be individual debates about certain objects. I mean, there is the current examination of the place of the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oriel College Oxford, which may result in it being moved. And part of the reason it may be moved is because there are certain people who do feel genuinely, I don't think they're putting it on, genuinely offended that he towers over the main quad at Oriel. And there have been statues moved in the City of London, which have caused a bit of a row. So I'm not saying that things shouldn't be moved, but broadly speaking, retain and explain is a relatively benign policy. What worries me most about the direction of travel of the government is that, I was the culture minister for 6 years, and without wishing to sound like I'm sort of dodging the issue, one of the principles, as it were, of our cultural policy has always been that the institutions themselves should be making these decisions, and that government ministers shouldn't interfere. Jenny Lee, who was the first culture minister appointed by Harold Wilson, I don't know, I can never remember whether it's apocryphal or not, but in theory, she summed up government policy as money and silence. You write the checks for the museums and the arts organizations, and then you stick well out of it. So you don't, and that's helpful in some ways because it means potentially you don't have to make a decision on whether you give back the Elgin marbles. That's a decision for the trustees of the British Museum. So I was a bit concerned when Oliver Dowden, who's a friend of mine, who's a man I admire, but summoned the heritage organisations to a sort of debate. But if it was a genuine debate about the current cultural debate, then that's all well and good. But it's a dangerous road to go down if you start trying to tell institutions what they should and shouldn't do with their collections. I have views on what they should and shouldn't do with their collections, which perhaps I can air now, but I certainly would try to avoid airing in public when I was the culture minister.
Well, there is this arm's length principle, which I know you support.
Yeah.
And but just to come back to the specific government policy, I understand there are also new laws being put in place to safeguard historic monuments across England specifically. But could it be said that conserving these public monuments is also to conserve their values? I mean, the main one that comes as pertinent, it's in the forefront of my mind, is with Edward Colston in Bristol. I mean, yes, he was a slave trader, but also I gather his statue was erected to celebrate his philanthropy. So it's very sort of complex debate when it comes to each monument.
Yeah, and I'll be interested to hear Corrie's views because, again, I'm not serving on the Cecil Rhodes committee. There's a committee of the great and the good that's been put together to decide the fate of Cecil Rhodes, and in a sense, it's a terrible job to have because whatever decision you make, you're going to annoy someone pretty intensely, and that goes.
Isn't that like being a government minister?
Exactly, which is why I'm no longer a government minister. But that's the Colston statue in a nutshell. There are plenty of people who are glad to see it dunked in the river. There are plenty of people who might think it's great that it's been taken down, but wouldn't have wanted it taken down in that way. And there are some who think, well, actually, it's a nuanced story. Colston's place in the history of Bristol, his statue should stay, but the context should be explained. And all those, to a certain extent, that's the kind of spectrum of the debate, and it's difficult to come down on a conclusion that's right, except to say that I haven't think criminal damage is wrong. But apart from that,
well, Corinne, the National Trust has announced plans to also keep its most as controversial objects to avoid shutting down that debate. But can a tiny plaque with a bit more historical context really outweigh a huge monument?
I think that's an interesting question, and the retain and explain policy is quite an interesting one. I mean, the explain part of it intrigues me, and I would applaud it. What a great idea! Let's explain. That's what the National Trust was trying to do in producing its report, and I mean, the explain policy is a kind of progress from the days of the early reception of that national report last year. Explaining is a very good idea. I know of historians of empire who are very much in favour of keeping statues in place. There's a range of views amongst historians about this, partly because there's an historian of the Black presence in Liverpool who loves to give walking tours around these statues. He says it's the most brilliant history lesson in colonial British history that you could get. But I think the issue of explaining is a complex one because, of course, Colston, we know that there was a long dialogue about Colston over many years by people who didn't want him honoured. And the question for those people was, well, who do we choose to honour? And interestingly, who have our predecessors chosen to honour? And as Ed says, these figures, and you yourself have said that these figures have very complex histories. But it is also true that there was a plaque put up to explain better and in more rounded terms the fuller history of Colston. And I know the historian in a local primary school that was involved with that. And there was an almighty row just about the explanation plaque. And there was a kind of tussle over how much was said about the slavery voyages which Colston is associated with. I mean, if you look on slavevoyages.org, you can see the kind of human story that's missing from that, with you know, the lists of the numbers of men, women and children who were effectively trafficked across the ocean. But let's not forget that that was legal at that time. It wasn't illegal activity until after the formal abolition of the slave trade. But it was also a deeply traumatic and ugly part of our history. So I think it's a complicated, I think we forget sometimes that only one statue has actually been torn down. And we can make out that, you know, that there's this really, sometimes I wonder if what the real threat is actually a kind of a rash of historical inquiry sweeping the country that is perceived to be more threatening than the pulling down of statues. But I do think that there is important evidence of our colonial past in our street names. And there is an argument that you can destroy that evidence. If you go around renaming streets, then you forget. You know, when in 3 generations' time, if a street is called Paradise Street instead of the name of a slave trader, might people forget about that history? But at the same time, of course, it's a complex debate, because we don't want to necessarily honour in the same way with our modern sensibility the people who our predecessors honoured. So it's complicated.
So it's the difference between honouring and reminding.
Yes. Absolutely.
Which is definitely
and
complicated.
of course, statues are all about honouring, aren't they? And you know, they are. You know, who wouldn't want a statue in a prominent place in a city to show their contribution to that city?
Well, I understand that the British Museum's approach with Sir Hans Sloane, who, with his bust, they've actually continued to put it in a very prominent location. Of course, they mentioned he bequeathed his huge collection, which was the foundation really, the British Museum, British Library, National History Museum, etc., but also mentioned his connection to the slave trade and tried to provide the full context. They don't say that he also invented hot chocolate, but that's by the by. And also, I gather that, say, with the National Trust, there's collections that depict Black people in ways that are stereotypical or objectified Black bodies are being removed. So there are some elements which are being removed for those particular reasons, which obviously is very important.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you've got all kinds of fairly insignificant, say, porcelain figures which depict people of colour in really demeaning ways in lots of country houses, not just National Trust houses. So those don't seem to be particularly an issue. Removing those, they're just bits of porcelain behind cabinets and so on. But with the paintings, there are around 300 paintings depicting mostly children of colour who were brought to Britain. I mean, I think we think that enslaved people were somewhere else off stage, but actually there are around 300 of these paintings depicting African children, sometimes Indian children, looking up adoringly at the main white kind of sitter for that portrait. And I think it's a question of how have we looked at those paintings. Again, it provides evidence of that rural Black presence, which is very important to remember. But it's also the fact that art historians have predominantly focused, well, almost exclusively focused on the white figure in the painting and not investigated who the Black sitter in the painting is. And so there are lots of art historians now who are interested in asking, well, who were these who were these people? Where were they buried? Is there a record in the local parish records? And I think that's a fascinating process. And lots of Black history groups have been doing fantastic work, going and looking at the parish records and finding out, well, yeah, that's probably the child that was baptized there would be about the same age and about the same time as that painting. It might be that child. And then discovering, for example, in Warwickshire, a whole load of other Black presences connected with other country houses. It was a kind of network. And why we wouldn't want to open up the Black histories of rural Warwickshire is a puzzle to me. I think it's absolutely fascinating and something well worth exploring. So sometimes these artistic objects, sometimes they're demeaning and need reinterpreting in a sensitive and humane way. Honouring the people who are being done violence to in those images, or demeaned, or put at the edge of the painting, and so on. But at the same time, it's a great way of opening up that history to visitors, because it's connected to those larger histories.
Absolutely. I'm just going to come back, Ed, to your point. We were talking earlier about the arm's length principle. Which I know you're a supporter of, and you mentioned earlier about this essentially a curatorial independence. Now, I gather that these regular meetings with DCMS are now called accountability meetings. In short, what are the dangers of ministers getting involved in these curatorial decisions?
Well, I just think, my feeling is be careful what you wish for. I mean, Oliver Dowden gave an interview at the weekend in which he said, the Elgin marbles shouldn't go back because you pull at a thread, and where does the unraveling end? At what point do you stop kind of sending everything back, as it were? But he's now immediately part of that debate. And if I've sort of changed my views slightly on the Elgin marbles. I think they probably should be returned to Greece. They're clearly an essential part of their heritage. And Corinne mentioned Stonehenge earlier, and I always kind of make the point, if we'd been invaded and somebody had carted off Stonehenge in the 19th century, having bought it off the occupying army, what would the British be thinking now? We'd probably be saying, can we have Stonehenge back? So I think, but the point is, I suppose this will sound deeply cynical, but I'm just making the point to make the point, as it were, which is, as culture minister, I would quite happily have said, well, that's a decision of the trustees of the British Museum. So if you start getting involved in that debate, you are also starting to tug at the thread where you can legitimately be asked about any object in any museum about what your view is about whether or not it should be returned. And at that point, you've crossed the line. I think the point about accountability to taxpayers as well has a sort of problematic element. I mean, obviously, museums are accountable to taxpayers. They get taxpayers' money, and they're audited by the DCMS to make sure that the money is not being spent on holidays in Rio de Janeiro. So we want to make sure there's no kind of fraud or dodgy spending. But in terms of accountability to taxpayer, what taxpayer are you talking about? There are plenty of people who do support. Indeed, as Policy Exchange found when it commissioned a survey, which I presume it hoped that 100% of the National Trust members would say that what was happening was an absolute disgrace, and discovered that actually, surprise, surprise, 76% of National Trust members are like members of the British public, which is that they're open-minded and curious. So, which taxpayer are you accountable to? There are plenty of taxpayers who support the curatorial decisions of museums, and yes, museums should be accountable to them, but I don't think it's necessarily the wisest decisions for ministers to say that they are the spokesman for the taxpayer.
But if we talked earlier about that objectivity and also having that one narrative, if museums and the heritage sector aren't accountable to DCMS about the narrative which they put forward, who are they accountable to? Who can monitor that effectively?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because you can obviously take extreme hypothetical examples if you were so minded. I think that, to a certain extent, you are accountable in many different ways. You're accountable in a straightforward financial way. There's no one would worries about that. It's quite right that, you know, the British Museum's accounts should be audited, and no one should worry about DCMS potentially holding a museum or an arts organisation to account if it thinks it's spending money badly or it's in financial trouble. The Arts Council has done that with some major arts organisations in the past. That's not part of this debate. But are you going to say that you should choose the repertoire as a minister? You should choose the repertoire of the Royal Opera House? No, of course you're not. Are you going to say that you should have a tour of the British Museum every year and say, no, I don't think that object should be there, it should be here, or why are you displaying this object? No, you shouldn't be doing that. That's a job for the trustees and the director of the museum, and they are accountable to their public. And to a certain extent, the public are entitled to vote with their feet. If a museum goes off the deep end in some way I can't particularly imagine at the moment, the public would no doubt vote with their feet and just not turn up to see stuff, or they would write in or email to say what their concerns are. And a lot of museums tend to have passionate groups of friends who make their feelings known if they think a museum director is going in a particular direction they're not particularly supportive of. But it's the same with all our public institutions, and which is why they work. You know, sometimes they do enrage us with their decisions. I'm not saying that I'm immune to occasionally being enraged by the BBC, but I don't want to direct the BBC's programming. And I think it's a very important principle. The BBC is funded by a license fee that keeps it independent from political decisions. And of course, every politician has to think if, you know, they may well think it's fine because I'm in charge and I know what I'm doing. Well, you're not going to be in charge forever. And some other government might come in that you profoundly disagree with, and you've found that you've laid the foundations for them to start directing cultural institutions, to start reflecting their agenda rather than your agenda.
It's interesting what you say. Also, as you talking about tugging that thread, once you start, it does unravel a huge amount of different elements. I mean, one of the things, Corinne, which the so-called Common Sense group did was they wrote to the Culture Secretary requesting that the National Trust's funding application to certain public institutions is removed. And isn't that quite scary, that actually if museums in the heritage sector aren't necessarily following a certain line in a historical way, then their funding might be threatened?
Yes, I think intellectual freedom, the freedom to research your own properties, is really, really important. And there was some, I would say, unattributed quote in the Daily Telegraph to say that, you know, anything I did again would not be funded. And I found that alarming. I just thought it's not the democratic Britain that I recognise. And as an academic, it's absolutely vital that if we have specialisms in particular areas, including sensitive histories, that there should be the freedom to pursue our own expertise, you know, to use our own expertise to pursue particular research. So yeah, that is worrying. I think it's important to ask who is best qualified to make decisions about allocation of research funding. You know, we have a good peer review system where your academic peers, no doubt of all persuasions and opinions, decide on the quality and the caliber of the research and the researcher, and they decide accordingly whether to fund that research, if it's a good application or if it's a shoddy application. They might decide to turn it down on that basis, but not on a political basis and not because of political pressure.
I think it's, you know, you can't, you know, no one is saying that institutions won't make the wrong decisions and won't make decisions to fund projects that, you know, in my opinion, for the sake of argument, shouldn't be funded. But the principle is about independence and choice. And I remember, I mean, this is a slightly weird anecdote perhaps, but I remember in the late 80s, I mean, I've always been a Tory, by the way.
We won't hold that against you. Sorry.
And I remember in the late 80s, you know, education was a pretty contested field. And I remember there was a teacher, I think it may have been in Bristol, who grandly, this was at a time when the Conservatives were introducing school choice and so on, grandly announced that she wouldn't teach Shakespeare in her schools because it was sort of terrible, presumably sort of, you know, whatever phrases of the moment you want to pull out. And I remember actually quietly supporting her, because although I think Shakespeare should be taught in schools, I thought if we as Conservatives believe in school choice, then parents can vote with their feet. And if you've got some teacher who, in my view, was making the wrong decision not to teach Shakespeare, that's a decision for the teacher. And it's a decision for the parents to say, well, actually, I'm not going to send my kids to your school if you're not going to teach Shakespeare. That's outrageous. And we have now a national curriculum, which itself has become a sort of, battleground often for what subjects are being taught and what subjects aren't, and so on. So in a very convoluted and slightly complicated way, I'm saying that the independence of institutions is paramount, but that doesn't mean that that one can claim that institutions will always make the right decision. They won't. They will make the wrong decisions. You've got to decide whether it's your role to kind of interfere at every drop of the hat or not. And my view is you'd be better off not interfering and allowing those institutions to make decisions with which you profoundly disagree, because that is an important point of principle.
And as you say, Corinne, there's also peer reviews. There is that level of critique within the museums and heritage sector, which is vital.
Yes, I mean, all like Ed says, all organisations, institutions, and research funding bodies, they all have a good, healthy system of checks and balances, and I think you have to respect that.
So it seems clear that whether we like it or not, there is a culture war. And I mean, the Common Sense Group again says they are ready for this culture war, and we are confident that our policy agenda will help win it. So where are the key battlegrounds at the moment, and how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that some of us don't want to fight a culture war. We're not interested in fighting. And I think that we need to get rid of all these metaphors of of war and violence, because actually, why not stop weaponizing history and just think about having conversations across all kinds of divides, cultural divides, generational divides. I've said this a few times in my own defense when I've felt so under attack, and that enriching to know more and to understand more about the world. More knowledge is good, less knowledge is bad. So let's have less shredding and threats of shredding documents, and more invitations to explore further those histories. And when you research things, you don't always find out what you want to find out. You don't always find out the thing which favors your own personal opinions. You sometimes find out things which are quite surprising and uncomfortable for you yourself as a researcher. So I think that that's clearly a better way to move forward together in also understanding, for example, underexplored things like the connection between rural poverty, rural industry, and empire. It's really interesting to understand how copper and the copper industry in Cornwall then relates to the history of slave trading in West Africa, for example, or with the example of North Wales, the fact that the whole infrastructure was funded by Jamaican sugar plantations worked by enslaved people, but at the same time, that slate quarry, which was paid for with that money, was also the site of one of Britain's most bitter industrial disputes. So exploring the overlaps between a variety of repressed histories would be a very positive thing in my view, and actually potentially not divisive at all, but rather unifying as people see how their histories intersect.
I think that it's a really, what is the culture war and where is it going is an interesting question. So let me just briefly sort of put a conservative perspective, a big C conservative perspective to a certain extent, which is that there is a belief on the right that the left is engaged in an agenda to kind of seize control of public institutions, and they do it by getting their people in to run them, dominating the universities, dominating the BBC, and therefore pushing forward a left-wing narrative. Now, there may be a kernel of truth in one point, where I could kind of meet the right, in a sort of space, which is take environmental policy, for example, take the green agenda. On the one hand, I obviously believe in climate change and believe we should do everything we can to mitigate against it and so on. But there is an element of truth if you say that there are some climate activists who use the climate agenda to attack capitalism. They're not actually interested in saving the planet. They're interested in destroying business because they don't like business. And you have to, to a certain extent, guard against that. So there's that element, I think, if you want to kind of get inside the head of the common sense group that believes that the public agenda, which is just to reinterpret history and put things in perspective, lying behind that is a hidden agenda to, seize control and push forward a socialist agenda. That would be the kind of case for the defense. My own view is that, as I say, I fully support what the National Trust has done. I think that we shouldn't be afraid to examine our own history and put it in perspective. We should be nervous about breaching things like the arm's length principle and trying to dictate what the cultural narrative should be and what it shouldn't, partly for reasons of self-preservation, because other people will be in power at some point in the future who we wouldn't want to be directing the cultural agenda. But change is often difficult, and a lot of people are small c conservative. But for me, what the culture war is about giving a voice to people who haven't had a voice before, whose stories and history haven't had a voice, to ensure that everyone in our country feels that they are part of our society. And the kind of last culture war that was fought, interestingly, the Conservatives were on the right side, which was gay marriage. And I remember as an MP, the biggest postbag I ever got, where people actually bothered to write letters, as opposed to downloading the templates, which has become the form of how you write to your MP these days, were people in my constituency opposed to gay marriage. I got about 500 emails and letters, people really opposed to it. And but the Tory government stuck to its guns, and the
coalition government,
and the sky did not fall in, and a lot of people have become very happy as a result. And that, to me, is the sort of direction of travel of the sort of work that the National Trust is doing, that people now feel their stories are being told, or their ancestors' stories are being told. They feel engaged in a way they weren't engaged before. And I think the result will, in the end up being extremely positive all round.
I think we've all alluded to Sathnam's book recently, and I'm going to ask you in a second for recommended reading just to finish us off. But I think he basically says that, and then to understand our complicated multicultural society, we need to learn more about British Empire and just learn more generally, and that's something which should actually be encouraged. But yes, as we come to the end, I would love to have more reading recommendations for our listeners, and for me, really, it would be lovely. So have you got any other thoughts? I see Ed's scouring his bookshelf.
Desperate attempt to sound learned.
I've got a few. I have a few suggestions. There are some older books. There's one by Rosina Visram called Ayahs, Lascars and Princes, which was written in the 1980s about the Indian and South Asian presence in Britain over a long historical period. And also David Olusoga's Black and British, A Forgotten History is a great account of the African connections.
Thank you. Ed, you can recommend Corinne's book as well, of course.
I would recommend Corinne's book, which I haven't read, but I'm sure is absolutely brilliant. And I have read Sathnam's book. But the book on my desk is David Hockney.
Aha.
Spring Cannot Be Cancelled, David Hockney with Martin Gayford. But and I'm currently reading Mick Herron, who is a novelist, who is the new John le Carré, as it were, whose hero, Jackson Lamb, is about the most politically incorrect hero you could possibly have. So just to correct the narrative that I'm not part of the hidden woke agenda.
Well, thank you so much for those recommendations and, for discussing and exploring such an important topic. There's so much more we could discuss and explore here, but we'll leave it there. Thank you, Corinne and Ed, and many thanks indeed for your time and insights today. Thank you also to Fiona Livingston and our sound editor, Merlin Thomas. Our theme music is composed by Robert Cochran. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you haven't done so already, be sure to check out all the other episodes from the Culture Bar, where you can hear from MPs, professors, a former professional football referee, a canon of a cathedral, festival managers, museum directors, and more. To get all that, please subscribe. See you next time.